Hello everybody, welcome to another video. This video is going to show you step by step how to install Ubuntu on an existing Windows 10 computer so we can dual boot going forward. Bear in mind the tools and software that you need. For the USB, I would recommend at least an 8GB in size or more. USB formatting software, so we can use SD card formatter, or if you haven't got that and don't want to install it, you can use Windows as well. USB boot creation media, so we can create the Ubuntu USB, so we can use Rufus or Etcher as the two main options here. We've also got the boot configuration option, so we could use BCD. There's a link here. I'll leave links in the description as well, or we can use a grub customizer as well. You need to download the above software, including Ubuntu, ideally the latest stable release as well. Here's a link to that here. I'm using Windows 10 here, and you can check that your system meets the minimum system requirements by going onto this link here. Now the first thing you should do before you begin is back up your system. Create ideally a system image so you can revert it back to exactly how it was, just in case anything does go wrong. Hopefully it shouldn't. This is a tried and tested method, but be on the safe side. Backup option that I'm talking about, just in case you wasn't aware, you can type backup in Windows, click backup, go to backup and restore Windows 7, even though it's actually 10, and then create a system image. Okay, so that's the level of backup that you should go for. Another point of advice is if you have fast start enabled, you should disable this because it is known to cause issues sometimes for dual booting system. So to turn off fast start, or to check it, you would go into the power options. There is also a batch file you can download and install, but I won't go into that here. I'll let you search that just in case you have any problems. Moving on to downloads. So download all the software that you need, including Ubuntu of course. So head over to ubuntu.com, download, and if you go onto the download tab here, you'll see the latest stable release, which as of today is 20.04 LTS. So you can click that and the download should automatically start. Mine is already downloaded, but you'll see this web page pop up and the download start, depending on your system and internet connection, a few minutes, possibly more. So while we're waiting for that, we can get our USB ready. Insert your USB. Firstly, we need to format it. So I'm going to use SD card formatter. And here, when you insert the card, you'll see it pop up here. Now, I've named my USB card Ubuntu because I've actually formatted it already, but you can change the name here. Go ahead and format. I'll do that for the purpose of the video so you can see what happens. There's nothing on the USB card, so that's fine. Click yes, and that is done. Now, note the file system is FAT32, which is fine as well. Okay, so that's done now. Now, to create the USB bootable media with Ubuntu, I'm going to use Etcher. So we're going to flash from file to the USB, which is fine. That's in the J drive. That's exactly what we need. Let's get the file. Okay, so we've got the ISO file. Once it's downloaded, of course, you can see it's just under 3GB. Here's the USB that I want to put it to. Just give that a bit of time. And here's the progress bar just here. Now if you are using Rufus, you'll just make sure that the default, if it isn't already, is in FAT32 format. Now I'm going to actually dual boot this onto a different computer, so you will see the screen and everything change in a moment. But once this is done, I'm going to head over and switch onto the system that I actually want to install it onto. Okay, so we're nearly done. It's now going to validate that and take a few moments. Okay, brilliant. So now the flash is complete. We've got a nice green tick, and that's confirmed as successful. And we can take out the USB, make sure you eject it safely. Firstly, what I'm going to do is we need to create the partition to install Ubuntu onto. So let's go to my PC. So let's go to this PC, and here you can see, if I make this bigger, I've just got one drive here. I haven't got multiple drives like some of you may do. But my main Windows, which is signified by the Windows logo here, is on the C drive, which is where it is usually. And you can see the size of this drive is 920GB, so there's plenty of room here. Okay, if you go into Control Panel or just search for Format, Disk Management here, we've got the recovery, which we don't want to touch, and then we've got the C drive. So we're going to focus on this part here, and here you can see where the USB would be highlighted if you've already got it inserted. I haven't. So what we're going to do is right click this one. We're going to shrink the volume. Ubuntu states that you need at least 25 gigabytes as this size. Now that will depend if you install more software or plan on saving more files, photos, etc. You're going to need more. Now in my opinion, I always found it easier to start small and be able to increase it into free part of the system, rather than trying to shrink it later if you start off creating too much of a size. It is possible, but it's just, that's my experience. Okay, so that's now created. Now it may be confusing because sometimes you may think, I don't want to shrink this volume, but actually what it's doing, or if you understand it as shrink this volume, means to create a volume of the size that you input. Our unallocated partition now, and it will show as a black bar because that's not been formatted and it's not usable. Now we don't need to format this partition here. That will happen automatically once we go through the installation of Ubuntu. This partition is now done, so this is where we're going to install into. So just keep an idea of these sizes. If you've got multiple partitions already, it may be a good note now to make a paper note of these sizes and the names, because that may just make it easier for you to identify this partition when you come to installation. In my case, it's pretty easy, so no need here. What we can now do is power this computer down, install the Ubuntu USB media we created earlier, and then we're going to go into the BIOS settings so we boot from that USB. Now depending on your system that will vary, so you can Google search it if you don't know what key to press. It may be an F10, F9 key for example. Okay, so my USB is now inserted. I've just turned the system back on. It will now load with the grub, and that should automatically go into Ubuntu live environment. If not, you can just select and enter. It's going to just check the file system. This process should take a couple of minutes. Now you will have an option to try Ubuntu and also install it. We're going to obviously install it today, but it may be an idea if you're not too familiar with it to try the install first, and it's just a lot easier if you don't like it at this stage not to carry on. You can also try this in a virtual machine, however the experience isn't as close, so I wouldn't rely on using the experience of a virtual machine to decide whether or not it's going to be good for you. Okay, so we're now in Ubuntu. Now this is booting from the USB, not from our hard drive at the moment. Okay, so this is the option I was talking about. We could either try it or just go ahead and install it onto the hard disk so that when we remove the USB, it will run as normal. In this case, we're going to go to install Ubuntu. Change the language at this stage if you need to. Now here, the keyboard layout. Just one tip I would do is just check the backslash on your keyboard. Now on mine, if I click the backslash, I get this arrow. So I'm just going to make sure I've got the right one. Perfect. So I just need to change that to English UK, and now it works fine. Now we've got two broad options here, the normal installation and minimal. So the first is equivalent to the old default bundle of utilities, applications, games and media players, a great launchpad for any Linux installation. The second takes considerably less storage space, but allows you to install only what you need. Would advise we're enabling both download updates and install third-party software just to make sure it works better. We're going to go with normal installation, especially as we've allowed 100 gigabytes, so it should be more than enough. And we're going to also install third-party software in my case, but you don't have to. So these two are optional. I'm going to go ahead and keep those in. Now in some cases, in the installation type here, you may get the option to install alongside Windows. So that would be usually the top first option. Here we've got two options, so we'll work with it. In our case, we don't want to erase the disk and install it in Ubuntu because that would make it a single boot to Ubuntu. We want to dual boot and still keep Windows. So we're going to do something else and configure this manually. There's three parts that we'll need to configure. That's the root partition, the swap allocation, and the bootloader as well. Now here, I would just take a moment to familiarize yourself with the drive as it stands now and just recognize the different partitions you have. Here we can easily identify from the size and the type of NTFS. These are going to be our Windows linked partitions. So we want to leave these parts alone. We created the 100 gigabyte partition, and that's seen here as the unusable space, and the size is in megabytes. So we'll be focusing on this one. Now again, the size allocation is in megabytes, not gigabytes, so simply times by 1000 of whatever you need. So let's click our unusable space. Now there is a problem here. Now where it says unusable, it should say free space. Now the reason being is there's actually a total of 5 partitions, including any unallocated space. Now the hard disk only supports 4 partitions, and we've created 5, the 5th being the partition space for installing Linux, so it's going to cause an issue. Now the simple way to tackle this problem is to maintain the 4 partition limit. What I'll do now is I'm going to go back into Windows, delete our partition, so we maintain 4 partitions in total. So I'll do that and I'll be straight back. Okay, so that's now been rectified. I've now got 4 partitions on the system. Now, as you can see, this automatically now is usable, so it's called free space, which is what it should be showing. Now, first, what we're going to do is create the root part of the partition scheme. If you click the plus here, we'll go ahead and make our root 25 gigs. You can leave it to the default of logical beginning of this space. To make it easier, just leave it for the default for the purpose of this video. No real need to change this here. ext4 journaling file system is fine, and we now need to just use this slash to signify the root partition. Now basically Ubuntu adheres to the file system hierarchy standard for directory and file naming, so that's why we need to do it. Now this standard allows users and software programs to predict the location of files and directories, and the root level directory, which is what we've done here, is represented by a simple slash. Now at the root level, all Ubuntu systems will include directories such as bin, boot, etc., home, and so on. Click OK. Just give that a moment to update. There we go. So that's our newly created root part here. Okay, so that's our newly created root level directory. Next, we're going to do the swap file. So swap file is, if you think of this as the overflow space. So when the main memory is full, the overflow space can be used for additional memory. You can create a swap partition that is used by the Linux to store idle processes when the RAM is particularly low. Now, the importance of this will depend how much RAM you already have. If you've got a low amount of physical RAM, this is going to be more important. If you've got 16, 32 gigabytes or more, this is not going to be as important. You'll probably not even need to use it. Now, as a guide, and without getting too deep into a field and going off onto a tangent, the simplest thing I can say is have RAM anywhere between the same size. So if you've got 16 gigabyte RAM physical, then times 1, so that would be 16 gigabyte as a swap. You could do 1.5 or double. So you could do 32 gigabytes if you wanted to, if your physical is 16 gigabyte. So let's click the free space again. Now I've got 16 gigabytes. I'm going to go with times 1. So that's 16 gigabytes here. We now need to let Ubuntu know this is the swap area. Press OK. That will take a moment to update. And finally, we're going to go onto the Grub bootloader. So the Grub bootloader is basically the first software program that runs when a computer starts. It is responsible for loading and transferring control to the operating system kernel software such as Herd or Linux. The kernel in turn initializes the rest of the operating system, e.g. GNU. Grub 2 has replaced what was formerly known as Grub. So bearing that in mind, we'll now do that. Now, a common issue here can be caused when people overwrite the existing Windows bootloader. Now, if we have a look at this system, you can see there's 3 parts with NTFS. Now, I know from looking at my own system and based on the size, this is where the Windows bootloader is currently. Now, some people overwrite the Windows bootloader, which for me is SDA1. That can cause problems. Now, instead of installing Grub onto the existing Windows bootloader partition, we will install it on the root created to signify or significantly reduce the likelihood of corruption. We can also remove Ubuntu later more easily as well. So let's go on to our root, and then it says device for bootloader installation. We want to change that to SDA5. Now continue by selecting install now. I would just take a moment to make sure you're happy with the configuration before you click install now. Now what we're going to do here is now click install after we've checked everything. So here's our NTFS Windows, 3 partitions here. We've got the free space, we've got the swap, we've got the root, and that's where we've put the Grub bootloader as well. Okay, so I've just had to refresh the partition table. For some reason it wasn't showing in the device bootloader installation. So all that I did is click quit, go back into it by double clicking the installation here, and then creating the root partition. I've just changed that to 90 gigabytes just so we've got a round figure, and then with the remaining I created the swap file, and now I can select SDA5, which is here, which is where I want the bootloader to be installed. Now click install. Now select your time zone and fill in the details as you wish. Now what it's doing here, as you can see the progress bar here, it's now copying all the files. Okay, so now when I reboot the system, it automatically goes into the Windows 10 operating system. So what I want to do is use this software. It's called EasyBCD. I'll leave a link in the description below. So we'll go to add new entry. We'll click Linux BSD tab here. Now, unfortunately, this EasyBCD will not work on the newer UEFI system. So if you go into your system configuration, you need to check that under the BIOS heading it states legacy. If it's UEFI, it will say UEFI, in which case in the latter this won't work. So assuming you've got a legacy system, non-UEFI, we'll carry on here. So we'll just select type as grub2. Name, we can say Ubuntu. Now we can click this plus sign. Okay, so it's now been added. So here's Ubuntu, we can see here. We can also now speed up the timer. So basically the screen that you get and it asks you to select which operating system will last for a while to give you a chance to make a selection. Otherwise it will go ahead with the default, which in my case is the Windows 10. I can change the default if, let's say, I use Ubuntu more. In my case I'm just going to leave it as it is. And the countdown, 30 seconds is really far too long, especially as I've got a mechanical hard drive, so it's going to be quite slow. So I'm going to just change that to 10 seconds, more than enough time. I'll keep the default here as it is, save the settings. Okay, so we've got an overview of the last 2 entries here, and we can see the Ubuntu path here under drive C, so that looks fine. So what I'm going to do now is reboot the system, and I should get an option so I can select, and if I don't make any selections then it will just boot into Windows 10. So we'll give that a go now and come out of here. Perfect. Now, as you can see here, it's now asking me to select an operating system. So I'm going to select Ubuntu. Notice how instead of using the Grub bootloader, this is within Windows. So we'll select Ubuntu and we should see that load in a second. Okay, so it's looking good so far. So Ubuntu's starting up. Fantastic. So we're on the login screen. going to the password that we created earlier in the video. On a hard drive, it took just over a minute to get to the login stage, so not too bad. Perfect, so that's all done, and as you can see, everything's working absolutely fine, no problem, and this is installed on the actual hard drive of the computer. So hope you found it useful. Any questions, post them down below. Otherwise, thanks for watching.